Today's lesson, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to continue this process of what we did the other day, and you're going to solve these equations. Now, I'm going to solve all these that are on the left, just like I did with the previous differentiated instruction video, and you're going to solve these ones on the right. So that way you have an example for each one that you're going to do. So let's start with number 3, this first problem. For instance, on this problem, I have 4x is equal to 16. So I do want to draw my line through there because that'll help us keep our equation balanced to make sure that whatever we do to the left, we do to the right. Now, I notice that my coefficient when I'm looking at this happens to be 4. You can see that right there. I'm going to highlight it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to divide by that number. And whatever I do to the left side of the equation, I got to do to the right. So I'm also going to divide the right side by 4. Now, just keep in mind that 4 divided by 4, if I were to put that in my calculator, if I hit Control Divide to get a fraction bar and put 4 over 4, it's just going to give me 1. So since that just gives me 1, then that means that this really is just 1x. And that's equal to whatever 16 divided by 4 is. So that fraction bar just represents division. So 16 divided by 4, I'm going to put that in my calculator. 16 divided by 4. I'm going to hit enter, and notice it gives me 4. So I'm going to go back to my paper, and I'm going to write 4 as my answer. So we're done with number 3, its first problem, and now we need to go to the second one. So I'm going to move my camera down a little bit. And we're going to follow a similar process on this one. I want you to notice that the only thing that's changed on this is that I have added the number 8. I still have 4 as my coefficient right here. But now we've added an 8 in here. We're going to have to deal with that. So before we can divide this 4, we're going to need to get rid of that 8. So let me draw my line through my equal sign so that we can be sure to keep this balanced. And in order to get rid of this 8, since it's positive, I'm going to have to subtract it to move it to the opposite side. Now, the reason I subtract is because right now it says plus. We always do the opposite of what it says. If it were to say minus, then I would add it. But because it says plus, I'm going to subtract it. So subtract it on this side. Now, 8 minus 8 gives me 0. So those is what we call cancel out. I'm simply left over here with 4x. And over here on the right, we also subtracted 8. So I need to put this in my calculator, 16 minus 8. Notice that gives me 8. So right here, I'm going to write positive 8. Now, our next step is to get rid of this coefficient of 4, right? Because when our final answer, we want it to just be an x with a coefficient of 1. And on the right side, we'll have to deal with this 8, because if we divide this side by our coefficient, we need to divide the right side by the coefficient. I do want you to remember that our goal is to get the variables left. So we want to get the variables on the left, and we want to get our constants on the right, which is our numbers that are written in black. So let me go ahead and do this final step. I'm going to divide by this coefficient right here of 4. And whatever number is in front of the variable is the number you divide by. And then I'm going to divide this other side by 4 as well. Now we already know that 4 will go into 4 one time, and that just leaves me with x. And then 8 divided by 4, if I go to my calculator, 8 divided by 4 gives me 2. And we're going to go ahead and box it. Now, let's move on to the next problem. It's going to get a little bit more complicated. From this problem to this one, we just added the 8. And if we go to our next one, we add one more thing. Notice this one, it has the 8, but then I added an 8x. So we have an additional variable. So now instead of just having a variable on one side, we have a variable on both sides. So I'm going to move my camera down. Our goal is the same. We want to get all our variables on the left, and we want all our constants on the right. So I'm going to start out by drawing the line through my equal sign to be sure I keep my equation balanced as I work on it. And I'm going to start first with moving my constant to the right. Now this is a positive 8, so I do the inverse operation, which is to subtract 8. So let me do that with my black pen. And I also subtract 8 from here. Now I want you to notice when I subtracted it from the right side, notice I did not subtract it from the variable, because we cannot subtract a constant from a variable because they are not like terms. We have to subtract like terms from each other, or add them for that matter. So in this case, the like term is the one without the variable, right? So I have a constant of 16. I have another constant that's negative 8. Now we know that 8 minus 8 is just going to give us 0. But 16 minus 8, that'll give me some other value. So we're going to put that one in the calculator. 16 minus 8, that gives me 8. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go ahead and write that value here. It gives me 8. And now I want to deal with the variable. Now remember, we're trying to get our constant on the right, and we're trying to get our variable on the left. Because of that, I need to make sure that I move this variable, which is 8x, over to the left. Now this is a positive 8x, so the way I'm going to move it to the left is by subtracting. So I'm going to put minus 8x. That becomes 0, x is on the right. And then I'm going to subtract it from the left, because whatever I do to the right, we got to do to the left. We always have to keep it balanced. Now I have 4x's minus 8x's. And like I've told you previously, whenever you're subtracting variables from each other, you cannot put the x in a calculator because it'll give you an error. But what we can do is ignore the x for a moment and just subtract the coefficient. In other words, I'm going to subtract 4 minus 8. So I am going to go ahead and write an x down here because we know we're going to have an x after the number. And now I'm going to do 4 minus 8 in my calculator to see what it gives me. And 4 minus 8 is going to give me negative 4. So I'm going to write negative 4. So I have negative 4x on the left, and I have 8 on the right. So all my variables are on the left, all my constants are on the right, and my final step is to divide by this coefficient of 4. So I'm going to do the division. I'm going to divide by negative 4. I'm also going to divide the other side by negative 4 so we can keep the equation balanced. Negative 4 going to negative 4 one time, just leaving me with the x, which is equal to whatever 8 divided by negative 4 is. So I'm going to put that in a calculator. I'm going to hit enter, and it tells me it's negative 2. So my answer here is x is equal to negative 2. Now let's go ahead and go to the next problem. After you solve this one to the right, following the same process that I followed here. The only difference is, I do want to note, and I didn't mention this earlier, but notice this is negative 20 or minus 20. So if we want to move the 20 over to the right, we would have to add 20 to it, because we always are going to have to do the inverse operation, which is also known as the opposite operation of what's taking place. So let's flip our paper. All right, we'll move this up. Notice that we use the same numbers. The only difference is now I added a set of parentheses in here, which is going to make this a little bit more challenging. So let's go ahead. We're going to start as usual by drawing our line. And now the first thing I want to do when I see parentheses is I want to distribute this number that's in front of the parenthesis to whatever is on the other side. In other words, I want to take this 4 that's in front of the parenthesis and multiply it to the two numbers on the inside of the parenthesis. So for instance, I'm going to multiply 4 times x. And that's going to give me 4 x's. Then I'm going to multiply that 4 times the 8. Now in this case, we don't have a variable, and that's why I use my black pen. It's just two constant values being multiplied. And 4 times 8, if I put that into my calculator, gives me 32. It is a positive 32, so I am going to put a plus sign in front of it so that these two terms, we can see how we're combining them. Now on the right side, I'm just going to rewrite this. I notice that this 8 has an x after it, so I'm going to write it in pink because it's a variable. And then I have a constant that's positive, so I'm going to write it in black. Remember, we want to keep the constant on the right, and we want our variables on the left. So we're going to go ahead and continue solving this. So at this point, if I want to move this positive 32 to the right side of my equation, I have to do the opposite of adding, because right now it's adding, and that's going to be subtracting. Now if I subtract it from the left, I also need to subtract it from the right. And 32 minus 32 is going to give me 0. So we like to say those cancel out. Then I have 16 minus 32. Now I don't know what that is, so I'm going to go to my calculator to use it. And notice I have negative 16. So I'm going to bring this down a little bit, negative 16. So now we have all our constants on the right, but now we have a variable on the right as well. So we need to move this variable to the left. So in order to move this positive 8x to the left, I have to do the inverse operation, which is going to be to subtract 8x. And that's going to leave me with 0 x's on the right. But then I need to go ahead and I need to subtract it from the left. Now once I do that, I'm going to bring my answer down, and I have 4 x's minus 8 x's. Now again, let's ignore the x's and just recognize that we have 4 minus 8. We're just going to subtract our coefficients because the calculator won't let us put a variable in. So if I have 4 x's and I'm subtracting 8 x's from it, it's going to leave me with negative 4 x's. Now our final step at this point is we want to go ahead and get rid of this negative 4, right? Because we want just a single variable, just a 1x. So I'm going to divide by my coefficient of negative 4. And if I divide on the left, I have to divide on the right. So I'm also going to come over here to the right and divide it by negative 4. I do want you to notice that I took the sign with it, right? Whatever, if it has a negative sign in front, then we have to bring the negative sign with the number we're dividing by. Negative 4, we're going to negative 4 one time, and it just leaves me with a single x. And negative 16 divided by negative 4, I'm not sure what that is. Let's put that in the calculator. So I'm going to hit Control Divide to get my fraction bar, and I have negative 16 over negative 4. And it gives me a positive 4. So I'm going to box it, and that is my final answer for this problem. My variable's on the left, my constant is on the right. So let's do the next problem. It gets a little bit more complicated, right? Notice we only had one set of parentheses here, but on this one we now have 2 sets of parentheses. So it's going to be a little bit more challenging. We'll have to distribute 2 times, right? 1 time on the left and a second time on the right. Let's go ahead and look at that problem and do it. So I'm going to highlight the numbers that we're going to distribute, which is going to be the 4, and then we'll do the 2 second. So first of all, right here, I'm going to have 4 times x. And if I multiply that, it's going to give me 4x. And then I'm going to have 4 times 4. And if I multiply that in my calculator, 4 times 4 is going to give me 16. And that's a positive 16. Bring down my equal sign. And then for this next one, I have 2 times 3x. Now notice this one is a little different because we have a coefficient of 3 on the x. So what we're really doing is we're multiplying 2 times the 3. And we know that an x is just going to come after it. So I'm going to write an x right here. And now I need to multiply 2 times 3 to see what it gives me for my coefficient. So I'm going to come over and I'm going to say 2 times 3, and it gives me 6. So I'm going to put a 6 in front of my x, because if I have multiplied 2 times 3 x's, I now have 6 x's. So this was 2 times 3x. Now we got to multiply this same 2 to the 16. So 2 times positive 16. So we'll go to our calculator to put that in. 2 times 16, and that gives me 32. So I'm going to say plus 32. And now that we have these values, right, we're going to treat it just like a regular equation. The distributive property is already done. I'm going to draw them on line to separate it. And my goal is to move all my constants to the right and all my variables to the left. So I'm going to start with variables this time because it really doesn't matter the order. I'm going to move this 6x over to the left. And since it's a positive 6x, I'm going to move it by subtracting 6x from both sides. Notice I'm matching and aligning the 6x with the 4x, right? Because we cannot subtract a variable from a constant. We can only subtract a variable from another variable. Now 6x minus 6x leaves me with 0 x's on this side, so we like to say they cancel. And now I have 4 x's minus 6 x's. Again, I'm going to ignore the x's for a moment and just consider that I'm subtracting a coefficient of 4 minus 6. So 4 minus 6 gives me negative 2. So this is going to be negative 2 x's left over. Now I got this other constant over here on the left, so I'm going to move this constant over to the right. And since this is adding 16 right here, I'm going to do the opposite, which is subtracting 16. That leaves me with 0, 16's on the left. And then I'm going to subtract 16 on the right. So 32 minus 16. It gives me positive 16. So I'm going to write that down here, positive 16. So the only thing I have left now is negative 2x on the left and positive 16 on the right. My final step is I want to get rid of this coefficient of negative 2. So I'm actually going to divide by that coefficient of negative 2. And what I'm left with is x is equal to whatever 16 over negative 2 is. So let's go ahead and put that in our calculator. Hit Control Divide for the fraction bar. I'm going to put my 16 in the numerator. I'm going to put my negative 2 in the denominator, and I'm going to hit enter, and it gives me negative 8. And that's my answer. I'm done. I have my x with a coefficient of 1 on the left, and I have my constant value, which is negative 8, on the right. So let's do our final problem. Now it gets a little harder because notice right here, right, we had the distributive property on both sides. Now on the bottom one, not only do we have the distributive property on both sides, but we have 2 negative signs that we have to deal with. So let's see how to do those. So we're going to start out the same. we're going to go ahead and distribute this negative sign that's on the outside. And then we're going to distribute this -2 that's on the outside. So we'll start with the first one. Now I do want you to remember that right here, anytime, I want you to draw you an arrow right there. Actually, should kind of point down a little bit. Let's make a new arrow. So have your arrow kind of point down and come back. And I want you to write invisible 1. Remember, there's always an invisible 1 in front of the parenthesis anytime there's a negative sign by itself. So this one has an invisible 1. So we're going to multiply this invisible 1 right here, that's negative, to this 2x. So I have -1 times 2x. And we're going to bring our answer down. So -1 times +2. And that gives me -2.
Good morning. It's attendance time. Good morning. It's attendance time.
So I end up with -2x. Now I'm going to take that -1 and multiply it to -4. So -1 times -4. So let's put that in our calculator. -1 times -4. And that gives me a +4. So I'm going to write +4. Then I'm going to write my equal sign. And now we have to distribute this value right here, -2 to +8x. So -2 times 8x. So I'm going to multiply the -2 to the coefficient. It's going to give me my answer, and that's going to be some value times x. So -2 times 8, and it gives me -16. And then I'm going to go ahead and take this -2 and multiply it to my -16. So -2 times -16. And we'll see what that gives us. And that gives me +32. So I'm going to go ahead and put +32. And now we have a regular old equation. We just need to get all our variables on the left and all our constants on the right. So I'm going to draw my line through the equal sign. And I want to go ahead, I'm going to move my variable first again. I'm going to move this -16x to the left. So to move it, since it's negative, I'm going to go ahead and make it positive.
It's attendance time. Please stop what you're doing and take your attendance.
So I'm going to add 16x.
That are supposed to be in Mr. West's room for the class.
That leaves me with 0.
All the teachers have received an email with a list of students who are supposed to report to Mr. West for the class.
So why this side gave me 0, -2 plus 16.
Thank you.
-2 plus 16 gives me 14. So I'm going to write that down. So I have 14x. Now, over here, notice I have this +4. It's a constant, so I need to move it to the right. To move it, I am going to have to subtract it because we always got to do the opposite or inverse operation. That leaves me with 0 on the left, so those cancel. And then I'll subtract 4 over here, and I'm going to put this in my calculator to see what it leaves me with. So 32 minus 4. And that leaves me with 28. So I'm left with all the variables on the left, which is 14x, and my constant on the right, which is 28. My final step is to divide this value from x, because remember we just want 1x, a coefficient of 1. So I am going to divide by 14. And I'm also going to divide this side by 14. So we got to keep it balanced. 14 is going to 14 one time. That simply leaves me with just 1x. which is equal to whatever 28 divided by 14 is. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in my calculator and see what it gives me. Put my fraction bar, and 28 divided by 14 is going to give me 2. So my answer to this problem is x equals 2. So now you have an example for each problem on the right. So go ahead and do your best to complete those problems on the right. Then when you're done, let me know so that I can check them.